Have you ever wondered why some of us seem to be born with a soul laid bare? Why we feel the world with such intensity that sometimes it wounds us simply by existing? And more deeply, why does pain seem to define us more than any virtue?
Nietzsche once said, "There is always some madness in love, but there is always some reason in madness." Carl Jung, digging even deeper, stated, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." But what if that light never enters? What if the wound becomes a home? In this video, we will explore a journey that not everyone has the courage to take. The transition from the wounded empath to the awakened warrior, one who not only feels the world but transforms it. We're not talking about superficial positivity. We're talking about crossing the dark valley of the soul, diving into the chaos of the unconscious, facing demons you never even knew existed, and emerging on the other side more whole than ever. All of us at times treat others unfairly with suspicion. All of us in some way have confused our pain with our identity. And all of us, if we're honest, have used suffering as armor to avoid facing the freedom that healing would bring us. This video is not about self-help, it's about self-truth. Jung spoke of individuation as the most important process of human life, becoming who you truly are, integrating light and shadow, vulnerability and strength. But this path is not paved with easy answers. It demands that you die psychologically and be reborn into something you may have never dared to be. Today you won't be watching an explanation. You will feel a truth. You will realize that the empath, this hypersensitive being often considered fragile, carries within them the potential of the most dangerous and loving of warriors. And what if I told you that your pain, the one that has followed you in silence since childhood, is not a punishment, but a seed? Perhaps you are about to discover that everything that once made you feel broken was, in fact, the map to your strength. If this resonates with something hidden inside you, then keep going, because now the true journey begins. There is a pain that does not bleed. It hides in gentle gestures and careful words, in smiles that apologize for existing. It is the pain of the empath, the one who feels before understanding, who absorbs the world even before knowing if they are ready for it. Often, those on the outside imagine that this kind of sensitivity is a gift, a blessing, but in reality, it feels more like a burden carried in the dark. Jung called this the archetype of the wounded healer, the soul with a strange ability to clearly see the pain of others, yet remain blind to its own wound. It is as if other people's suffering becomes a mirror in which we see everything except our own reflection. And this is where the great mistake begins. The wounded empath silently believes that their pain is necessary for love, as if healing would betray their essence. How many times have you felt that if you stopped suffering, you would also stop feeling, as if suffering were the only true bridge between you and the world? Jung noticed something that few psychologists dared to name, the attachment to pain, not out of masochism but out of identity. He called it the wound attachment syndrome, when suffering ceases to be just an experience and becomes an internal place where we take shelter. Imagine growing up believing that your worth lies in your ability to endure, that the more you suffer, the purer you are. This is the perverse logic that turns the empath into a martyr, and the martyr into a prisoner of themselves. You may have even learned that the world is an unsafe place, and that being too strong makes you resemble those who once hurt you. So you choose weakness as a shelter, as if it were proof of goodness. But that choice over time demands a price. You begin to disappear inside yourself. And this disappearance is silent. You keep helping, smiling, saying, "It's fine," while something inside you screams, suffocated. You become an expert at calming others, but incapable of listening to your own chaos. Jung saw this in many of his patients, people who, even with all the knowledge and tools to heal, fiercely resisted transformation, because deep down they felt that losing their pain would mean losing themselves. It is a cruel paradox, to want healing but fear the emptiness that might come after, as if there were no you beyond the pain. This is the invisible prison of the wounded empath, and perhaps you're living in it right now, hiding behind sensitivity, using your empathy as a shield so you won't have to rise, take a stand, and say no. But pay attention, empathy without boundaries turns into self-destruction disguised as love. The wound you carry can indeed be the beginning of your inner revolution, but only if you stop using it as an excuse to remain small. You were not born to bleed in silence. You were born to transform this pain into language, this fragility into strength. But for that, you must take the first step. Stop hiding behind the wound. Maybe this chapter will not offer you relief, and that's okay. It wasn't written to comfort you, but to shake you awake. Are you ready to abandon the role of the victim? Because if you are, the warrior within you has been waiting for years to be awakened. There is a part within us that we spend our whole lives trying to hide. It doesn't show up on social media, nor in the hugs we give in public, but it is there, in moments of silence, in bursts of anger we can't explain, in the feeling of pretending to be someone we are not. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and the empath, this sensitive soul that feels everything and absorbs it all, often carries it with even more intensity. After all, since childhood, the empath learned that feeling too much was a problem. Being overly sensitive, crying over silly reasons, having emotional outbursts, all of this was judged, ridiculed, or silenced. And what does a child learn to do in the face of pain? They hide, they repress. They invent a more acceptable version of themselves. The problem is that over time, this acceptable version becomes the only version the person shows, and everything that doesn't fit into it, anger, frustration, selfishness, desire for power, gets pushed down into the depths of the psyche, where the shadow grows. Jung noticed that many sensitive people avoid confronting their own shadow because they are afraid of becoming like those who hurt them. They confuse strength with aggressiveness, boundaries with selfishness, firmness with coldness. So they choose an overly gentle, passive, submissive posture, all to avoid the risk of hurting others. But this comes at a price. When you live only halfway, denying essential parts of who you are, the body and mind begin to send signals. You feel emotionally drained. You feel like you're always giving more than you receive. You feel guilty for wanting to rest. You judge yourself for feeling anger. And deep down, you feel like an imposter, someone who pretends to be kind all the time, but hides a latent anger they don't know how to name. This is the prison of the wounded empath. Jung said, no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. And this applies especially to empaths who believe that being light means never contradicting themselves, never standing up, never saying enough. But being light, in truth, is different. It's recognizing that there is darkness within us, and that it also has something to teach us. The process of integrating the shadow is exactly that, to stop running from the parts you learn to reject and start embracing them with awareness. This doesn't mean you'll go around hurting others or become cruel. On the contrary, when you acknowledge your anger, it stops controlling you. When you understand your selfishness, it stops showing up between the lines. When you reconcile with your pain, it stops ruling your decisions. True empathy is not erasing yourself for the sake of another. It is being so whole within yourself that you can open up without losing yourself. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you that screams when you stay silent for too long, that feels anger when you allow abuse, that rebels when you accept living beneath what you deserve. Integrating it is the beginning of your crossing. It is the moment when you stop being only sensitive and start being whole. The empath's crossing begins the moment they grow tired of suffering, but we are not talking about ordinary fatigue. It is an existential exhaustion, a weariness that comes from the soul. It's when a person realizes they can no longer bear being everyone's emotional pillar while falling apart inside. This is the breaking point, and also the first step toward transformation. Carl Jung called this process individuation. In other words, it is when an individual decides to become who they truly are, no longer who they learned to be in order to survive. For the empath, this path is even more challenging because they carry immense emotional baggage, unprocessed trauma, the weight of other people's expectations, guilt for saying no, and the fear of losing bonds if they start to put themselves first. The crossing begins when the empath understands that their empathy should not be a sentence, that they don't need to carry the pain of the world on their shoulders to be a good person. And above all, that being sensitive does not mean being weak. This insight, however liberating, usually comes with a deep sense of fear. Because until then, pain was a familiar place. Leaving it feels like abandoning the only identity that ever seemed to work. Many empaths live much of their lives inside the archetype of the wounded helper. They are great at giving advice, at being available, at listening. But when they look at themselves, they feel paralyzed, as if they had no permission to heal. The crossing requires breaking this logic. It is necessary to understand that helping others from one's own pain is not noble. It is unsustainable. At this point, an internal process of deconstruction begins. The empath must review their beliefs about strength, worthiness, care, and boundaries. They must question whether they are being kind or simply afraid of conflict. They must ask themselves if they are truly being generous or if they have learned that they are only worthy of love when they are sacrificing themselves. And these questions do not have quick answers. They hurt, because they touch deep wounds, many of them created in childhood. During the crossing, it is common for old relationships to fall apart, not because the empath has become cold, but because they are no longer easily manipulated. People who were used to their passivity may react badly to this new posture. This does create loneliness, yes, but it also creates space for new, healthier connections based on authenticity and mutual respect. Another crucial point in this stage is the emergence of guilt. When the empath begins to choose themselves, they feel guilty for it. Guilty for not picking up the phone right away, for saying, "I can't," for prioritizing their own rest. And here is where the journey requires courage, because guilt will come knocking many times, and the empath must learn not to let it in. Jung said that true transformation requires a kind of psychological death, and he was right. The crossing is, in a way, a death. The death of the wounded identity, the martyr role, the emotional dependence. But it is also a birth, a rebirth of someone who no longer needs to define themselves through pain. When the empath realizes they can be sensitive and strong at the same time, that they can have compassion while keeping boundaries, that they can feel deeply without erasing themselves, they begin to access a new identity. And this identity is the foundation of what Jung called the integrated warrior, the one who acts from the center, not from the wound. The crossing is long, uncomfortable, and full of twists and turns, but it is also the greatest act of self-love an empath can offer themselves, because only when they cross their own abyss do they discover that pain was never their home, it was only the beginning of the path. The empath who reaches this point is no longer the same. Something inside them has changed permanently. Pain is no longer their identity, guilt has lost its grip, and the need for approval is giving way to a new kind of silence, the silence of firmness. The warrior is not someone who stopped feeling. On the contrary, it is precisely because they have felt so much that they learned how to protect themselves. Carl Jung called this stage total integration. The empath, now a warrior, no longer denies their own sensitivity, but neither do they offer it as a sacrifice. They understand that empathy is not an obligation. It is a conscious choice, and helping others cannot come at the cost of oneself. This change may seem subtle from the outside, but internally it is revolutionary. The warrior is the one who knows how to say no without raising their voice, who listens to their body before accepting invitations, who recognizes when they are being manipulated and doesn't pretend not to notice. They are not cold, but they are no longer vulnerable to the emotional pressures of others. They have learned that caring for people does not mean carrying their problems. Many believe this stance has made them less empathetic, less available, less good. But they don't understand that the warrior did not pull away out of coldness, but out of integrity. They withdraw to protect their peace, to preserve their energy, to sustain their own clarity. Because now they know that an exhausted empath heals no one. They only repeat the cycle. This new place is unsettling at first. The empath, now more whole, must deal with the discomfort of those who were used to their wounded version. Some accuse them of having changed, others say they have become harder, more selfish, but they no longer need that approval. They know they can only offer something real when they are whole. And being whole sometimes requires stepping away from places where there was only depletion. The warrior also understands that their sensitivity is indeed a gift, but a gift that needs boundaries in order to flourish. They learn to channel this sensitivity into projects, into art, into true healing, no longer into unbalanced relationships, toxic friendships, or environments that drain their vitality. Jung said that the true healer is the one who has healed themselves first, and that is exactly what the empath, now a warrior, becomes. A living example that it is possible to feel deeply without destroying oneself in the process. They are capable of being present with the pain of others without absorbing it as if it were their own. They listen without drowning. They care without erasing themselves, and most powerful of all, they now inspire through example. Because there is something undeniably strong about someone who has walked through their own darkness and returned with light in their eyes. Not the superficial light of forced optimism, but the deep light of someone who knows hell and chose not to live there. This presence changes environments. It transforms without needing to persuade. The warrior is not invincible. They still feel, they still make mistakes, they still cry, but now they know how to return. They know how to recompose themselves. They know when they are being drained, and they know how to protect themselves. This wisdom is the fruit of the journey, of the crossing, of facing the shadow, and of renouncing the wound as identity. At the core, the empath never stopped being an empath. They simply learned that their sensitivity should not be a sentence, but a tool, a way of seeing the world with depth, but also of acting with presence and discernment. And perhaps this is the most beautiful stage of the journey, when you discover that you can be sensitive and at the same time unshakable. The journey from empath to warrior is not about ceasing to feel, but about learning to feel with awareness. It is about leaving behind the role of victim and taking responsibility for oneself. It is not about denying pain, but about choosing what to do with it. Because at the end of the day, your sensitivity is not weakness, it is power. And when it finds structure, something rare is born, someone who feels deeply and remains whole. If you made it this far, that already says a lot about you. Not everyone stays until the end of a video like this, because here there was no magic formula, no quick fixes. There was truth, there was pain, there was shadow. And if you stayed, it's because something inside you is tired of hiding, and maybe it's ready to awaken. Thank you, truly, for choosing to feel instead of running away, for allowing this content to move through you. That is not small, that is emotional maturity. That is the beginning of the crossing. You may think you're alone in all of this, but I assure you, there are many people in silence living the same process, and maybe today you recognize yourself in words you had never heard before. I know how hard it is. I was once the one who confused empathy with obligation, sensitivity with weakness, compassion with self-abandonment, and it took me a long time to understand that I didn't have to empty myself just to be accepted, that it was possible to be sensitive and still have boundaries, to feel deeply and still protect myself. That discovery changed my life, and I sincerely hope this video has planted that same seed in you. If this message resonated with you, if it found an echo in some forgotten place inside you, then subscribe to the channel, not for the algorithm, but for connection. This space is for those who feel too much, think too much, and still don't give up trying to understand themselves. Leave a like, yes. It helps this message reach other empaths who are still lost in their own wounds. And comment below, I'm on the journey. It's a symbolic way to raise your hand, to say me too, to show that the pain you feel has mirrors, has voices, has company. And the two videos playing on the screen right now, one of them will make you face something you've been avoiding for years, gently but without anesthesia. The other, it might be the exact push you needed to stop merely surviving and start living more fully. Watch, but watch with presence, because sometimes all we need is the right sentence, spoken at the right moment, to change the course of everything. I'll see you in the next video, or maybe in a quiet moment between pain and healing. And if it's hard, breathe. The warrior you're looking for is already inside you.